And welcome to our presentation. Today we're going to be covering advanced hazard analysis. So let's dive in. We're going to kick it off with the regulations associated with hazard analysis. And there aren't a lot. So we're going to just be looking at preventive controls for human food regulations. At the very top, you can see there's a small section A that says you must do this. You must determine whether there are any hazards requiring a preventive control. Now, there are two major fundamental parts to hazard analysis, and their identification and evaluation. We're going to take a look at those requirements. So here you can see the top one, determine whether or not there are any hazards that require preventive control. So just instructing us to document that, put it in writing. Now, hazard identification kicks off with enumerating the different types of hazards. So it begins with those that are known or reasonably foreseeable that are biological, chemical, or physical. Conveniently, they provide us with some examples. Now below, you'll notice that they say known or reasonably foreseeable again. Only this time, they're identifying what may be present in any food for the following reasons. So hazards occurring naturally, think poisonous mushrooms, happens naturally. Heavy metals in the soil would be another example of one. Those that might be unintentionally introduced could be like listeria getting onto a draining table where there might be food contact. And a hazard intentionally introduced for purposes of economic gain, we're going to cover that in a different presentation. But remember, a hazard is anything that causes injury or illness. It's not just to make a profit. Okay, now hazard evaluation kicks off with a little bit more meat. They right away get to the point. Hey, you need to evaluate severity and probability. So if you have a metal detector and you say, oh, well, the chances of probability of me having metal in my product are very low because I have a metal detector. FDA wants you to remember that this is in the absence of the control. You might say, well, someone would never, wouldn't be severe because the person would find the metal in the first place. Well, FDA again wants you to consider, no, they haven't found it. So what happens if they do bite into the metal? So severity and probability, they do ask that you consider environmental pathogens. We're not going to talk about this in this presentation right now. Just be aware that it's required where there's no kill step after packaging or in the absence of a lethal control applied. Okay, the rest of the hazard evaluation section deals with the effect of the following 10 things on the safety of the finished food for the intended consumer. Great checklist to have in the back of your pocket, in your back pocket, when you're considering those things that you ought to consider in the hazard analysis. Now let's move on to the next point, which is bundling products. I love to bundle products. As you see here, I made a little chart for you. You can see that there is an optimal aggregation of risk here. If you were to bundle everything into one, so take all of these things, fruits, vegetables, and spices, put them all into the same basket, pardon the pun, you would have the highest amount of efficiency, but the lowest amount of precision. So it wouldn't be terribly helpful. But finding 50-50 isn't always exactly what you're looking for either. You may actually decide, well, like this product's unique, even though it might be included in spices, so I'm going to treat it separately. So it's not uncommon for people to break those out. Now, if the process is the same, then by all means, you may want to keep them together. But if there's slight processing changes that make it fairly distinct and at a different risk level, you may want to break it out. All right, moving on. Now, this is what I call the funnel. I generally find people who meet up to about a C, so that's passing, or a B, and some, in rare cases, an A. So when you're doing a hazard analysis, I really like starting with the Appendix 1 guidance and the Bad Bug Book. That articulates what hazards FDA associates with specific commodities. And the Bad Bug Book covers essentially all those harmful microorganisms we're concerned about. So that's a great place to start. Next is considering a guidance for your industry. So if you're in dairy, juice, spices, FDA has developed specific guidances for your industry. And lastly is historical data. So if you do have a problem in your own facility, well, you need to consider that too. Now, people go above and beyond that when they start looking at industry best practices. In some cases, if they find there are no hazards identified using any of these resources, you might turn to history of recalls and see if there have been any recalls associated with your product and the hazard that you've identified. Now, another level up is looking at university extension articles. Just remember that, there's a joke, how many researchers does it take to screw in a light bulb? Well, our research shows one, but more research is needed. It's hard to sort of use research, which relies on doubt to drive progress. It's hard to rely on those to dismiss hazards because they're always kind of open-ended. Just be aware of that when you're using university articles. And then there's risk ranking models, which we're going to get into in our next video.